Welcome to a special episode of Tech News Briefing for Monday, April 24th. I'm Zoe Thomas for the Wall Street Journal. This is the fourth episode of our series, Artificially Minded, where we look at how artificial intelligence is changing our lives, livelihoods, and culture. The first three episodes can be found in this feed. We look at the fundamentals of AI, answer your questions, and look at how new AI tools are upending creative jobs. And if you have any questions or comments about the series or ideas for future episodes, send us an email at tnb@wsj.com. Today, we're stepping into the thorny question of liability. Who's responsible for the content generative AI creates? New generative artificial intelligence tools, chatbots like ChatGPT, and new AI-powered search engines allow users to type in a prompt like, "Tell me about Abraham Lincoln," and get a full conversational answer back. These online programs can get a lot of things right, but they can also get things wrong. And the question of how to deal with this is one more tech companies, lawmakers, and legal scholars are starting to grapple with in different ways. To start, I want to tell you about a situation happening in Australia.
I do recall that it was on a Sunday evening, and once I found it, I was quite staggered. I had to read it and reread it several times.
Brian Hood is the mayor of Hepburnshire, a council outside of Melbourne. He's exploring the possibility of suing OpenAI, the maker of ChatGPT, for defamation.
ChatGPT was making very false statements about me, very serious false statements, claiming that I'd been charged with serious criminal offences, that I'd been sentenced to jail, that I'd been found guilty of those offences, all of which is very untrue.
From 2004 to 2008, Hood worked for a company that made banknotes, cash, for government central banks. While working there, he discovered that some people were paying bribes to foreign officials to secure contracts, and he reported this to authorities. It led to a massive investigation that hit the media in 2009, and it resulted in arrests and jail time for those involved, and became one of Australia's biggest banking scandals. But Hood says friends and constituents told him that when they asked ChatGPT who he was and what his involvement in that scandal was, it didn't say he was the whistleblower. It said the exact opposite. So he quickly went on the platform to check things out himself.
It was saying that I was one of the perpetrators, that I was one of the people charged with the offences, found guilty of them, sentenced to jail, that I was on the other side of the table, if you like.
When Hood discovered this error, he was concerned and contacted local lawyers to see what could be done. The lawyers took the first step under Australian law to file a defamation case, sending a concerns notice to OpenAI with a list of demands that included removing the defamatory statement from ChatGPT, a public apology, and monetary compensation. OpenAI had 28 days to respond, and Hood's lawyer says the company has, but not to their satisfaction, and now Hood is considering his options, including formally taking this to court. And since Hood's lawyers contacted OpenAI, they say it has removed mentions of Brian Hood from ChatGPT. When we tested this, the program returned messages like, "Sorry, an error has occurred." We reached out to OpenAI about this, but it did not respond to a request for comment. Now, OpenAI's terms of use do say that some of ChatGPT's responses may not be accurate, and it also has a disclaimer at the bottom of the chatbot's site echoing that statement. But for Hood, that's not enough. You've sent this letter to OpenAI. What do you hope is the outcome of all of this?
Well, hopefully there's several outcomes. I'd like them to correct the record and fix their systems so that it doesn't make these disparaging comments about me. I'd like an apology. I'd like some sort of reassurance that their tool is now going to be accurate and reliable.
So why are we telling you Brian Hood's story? Because it's not the only mistake a generative AI tool has made. And you may have already come across other stories of people claiming to be harmed by incorrect information from AI chatbots. When I asked ChatGPT, who is Zoe Thomas, the host of Tech News Briefing, it says I've worked at several outlets I've never reported for and graduated from universities I've never attended. In 4 attempts, it didn't get it right. So how do companies building AI tools tackle this challenge? And what are their obligations under the law? Before we get into the question of the law, let's quickly talk about why generative AI programs might get something wrong. These hallucinations can happen because the data that these programs draw from may have incorrect or incomplete information. As you're probably aware, the internet is full of inaccuracies. In fact, a 2016 poll from Pew Research found almost a quarter of Americans said they've shared made-up news, either knowingly or unwittingly. On top of that, the programs aren't necessarily trying to give you the right answers. They're trying to formulate answers that sound natural, to form sentences where one word flows after another, to create reasonable-sounding responses. And even the makers of these programs say they can't predict what the programs are going to say. So who is responsible when programs like ChatGPT say something incorrect or even harmful? Every country has different laws on this. What applies to mayorhood in Australia won't necessarily be the case for others around the world. In the US, it's a really tricky question. There's a provision of a law that you may have heard of, Section 230 of the 1996 Communication Decency Act. It protects online platforms like Facebook, Twitter, or Google from being held liable for content posted by users.
So, for the most part, the people who post content online are the people responsible for it.
Jason Schultz is the director of New York University's Technology Law and Policy Clinic.
So if I post a photo, or I say something on Twitter, or I message someone, or I put up a website, whatever happens tends to be something where I'm held accountable, not the platform that hosts it.
Section 230 says online platforms are like public squares. Companies that make them aren't responsible for what people say in them. But the thing is, that hinges on something important. The idea that platforms don't create the content. They just host it. There's even a case testing the limits of Section 230 at the Supreme Court right now, Gonzalez v. Google. It questions whether Google's subsidiary YouTube should be held responsible for content linked to the 2015 Paris terrorist attacks. The families of victims argue YouTube failed to take down some ISIS terrorist videos and even recommended them to users. They say that makes Google liable for damages, although they haven't presented evidence that the terrorists involved saw these videos. Google has argued YouTube was the host of this information and is therefore protected by Section 230. The court hasn't issued a ruling yet. But experts say this case could also impact how courts deal with generative AI.
Generative AI is this weird mixture because what it does is it trains on user content, right? It trains on the whole internet. And then it responds to a prompt by a user. So is that content created by the company? The company can't predict ahead of time what the generative AI tool is going to say. So it doesn't quite create the content in that sense, but they certainly designed and engineered the program. They know that it's capable of doing these things. They certainly could test it and find out that it will tell you lies and it will tell you to do horrible things if you ask it to do. Tell me all the horrible things I can do.
If you ask it to is the key here, to understanding who might be considered the creator of an answer on a generative AI chatbot. If I were to search something like, how do I get blood off my carpet? If I search it in, say, Google search versus searching something like that on ChatGPT or another AI generator, how is that different or similar in terms of legal liability?
In general, CD 230 would completely cover this for like a general search engine because, again, it's a neutral platform in that sense of like you're requesting content, it searches third-party websites. So it's not like Google wrote the web page, right? It's just pointing you to something. With ChatGPT and some of these generative AIs, it will depend on the information is characterized. If it says, and again, this is what's hard because you can't predict exactly what they'll say. Like that's part of what's exciting about them is what's going to happen now? What if I ask it this way? What if I have a follow-up question, right? It might say, oh, if you're interested in getting blood off a carpet, here are some standardized techniques and here's some links. Or it could say, well, it depends on why you want to get the blood off the carpet. If you want to get the blood off the carpet because you killed someone and you don't want to get caught by the cops, here's a really great way to do it. If you want to get the blood off the carpet because you cut yourself shaving, then don't worry about this and do it this way, right? Like there it is a little more focused, right?
So the use of generative AI blurs the line between creator and platform.
So if the prompt is, please summarize the most efficient ways to get blood off a carpet, fine. But if it were to be a kind of conversation where you're prompting, it's responding, and you get to the point where you're like, no, I really need to get rid of this to the point where a CSI person can't find it on my carpet, that's different. But then again, that's user prompting, right? That's user pushing it. And so I think with CDA 230, it's starting to feel more like a search engine to me if the user's pushing the answer and trying to get the generative AI to say something specific versus it's the design and training of the AI that puts out the harmful content.
I mean, the thing that stands out to me with all of this is the companies behind generative AI build the models, they decide what information is being put into it. So even if they don't know what's being predicted, they've already made decisions that impact what's going to show up in the answer, what could potentially show up in the answer. And that does seem fundamentally different than just saying, like, we have a platform, put up whatever, post to your friends, whatever you feel like.
It's funny. It is and it isn't, right? I mean, this is a little bit nitty gritty into like the how does AI get made, right? But most of these systems are trained on just massive data sets that are scraped from the internet. But part of the argument is the only way to get it so sophisticated to the point where it can handle almost any question is to train on things in the number of billions of things from the internet. And that's just, even for a company like, Meta or Google, like too many things to parse through. I mean, there's some obvious ones. I mean, like child pornography, something that is like threatening violence, but not in a 5 billion image data set. And so you kind of make this choice of like, am I going to train on this giant data set or not? And if I don't, the argument goes, my AI will not be as sophisticated. And this is what I mean. Like at some point, a court's going to say, here's the line. If you train on violent images that, or if you train on like other stuff that's very bad for people, then that's too much if you don't constrain it in certain ways. But I think there's going to be a lot of sympathy, again, for the technical arguments that you need it to understand the world writ large to be as sophisticated as it is before you tell it what it can and can't do.
The thing is, U.S. courts will likely not be the only place this gets sorted out. Lawmakers around the world are also debating and developing ways to regulate artificial intelligence. China, for example, has already put in place laws around algorithms and generative AI. Among other things, they prohibit the use of AI-generated content for spreading fake news or information deemed to be disruptive to the economy or national security. The European Union is working on a piece of legislation, the AI Act, that is expected to create new obligations for AI tools depending on how risky the law says they are. And last week, leaders at the EU's Parliament proposed adding new rules that would curb the power of many generative AI tools. And here in the US, where Section 230 has set so much of the stage for how internet platforms are treated, the Biden administration is weighing new AI regulations. The White House says it's particularly concerned that these tools could be used to discriminate or spread harmful information. A lot of people will be watching how these new legal landscapes shake out. In the meantime, there are already some people who are trying to address these risks at the engineering level. Remember those AI hallucinations we mentioned earlier? Let's take a moment to go over why they happen. Here's WSJ tech reporter Karen Howe explaining how they work.
I think there's a common misconception that when you're chatting with ChatGPT, it's sort of scanning the internet for information and then synthesizing it for you. That's not exactly how it works. It's actually trying to construct sentences that sound reasonable based on the probability of certain words and phrases being frequently used together. So it's not actually identifying specific pieces of information. It's literally just kind of a really powerful autocomplete where it takes words and then assembles them based on the frequency in which it sees it within the internet text.
Karen stressed that you need to consider what data these programs are trained on and how reliable they are. Because garbage in, garbage out. But what can be really problematic, according to experts, is the conversational nature of these programs.
I think it's a user experience that people really like.
That's Raman Chowdhury. She's a data scientist and social scientist who's worked in the field of responsible AI for the last 5 years. Before starting a responsible AI consulting firm earlier this year, she worked for companies including Twitter and Accenture.
There is a conversational interactivity to it that's kind of more like you're talking to a smart researcher if you're trying to search for something.
Chowdhury says our ever-growing reliance on the internet for work and pleasure has made more people come to believe what they see and read online, no matter what the source. Over half of US adults under age 30 say they trust what they read on social media as much as what they see on national news outlets, according to a 2022 survey from the Pew Research Center.
Human beings tend to trust these environments. We have, at this point, pretty much been socialized to search online, and we don't generally go beyond the first 2 to 3 hits we get.
When search engines and AI chatbots are blended, as Microsoft and Google are working on, users may not even leave the search platform for another site to get the information they're after.
Unless you click on where the sources are coming from, you're not going to know whether or not it's a verifiable source. So in short, people will believe what they see because it's disembodied the source of information, which we can't now easily assess if we think it's trustworthy or not from the content itself, because it's reading to you like a story.
And Chowdhury says this conversational approach of generative AI chatbots is one of their best and worst features.
So I love the idea of it. I like the idea that it's more like talking to a research librarian if you're looking something up online. But the fact that you can't tell fact from fiction on it is quite scary.
Google said it's aware of the limitations of large language models that generative AI programs are built on, and acknowledged that its own AI-powered chatbot, Bard, is not immune to hallucinations, but said it's taking steps to ground Bard in more factual responses. Bard is not a search engine. Its purpose is to generate content. Users of Bard can go directly from that product to Google Search to check answers, and Google has placed limitations on back-and-forth dialogue between Bard and users to keep conversations with the chatbot topical. The company also stresses that its generative AI tool is still experimental. A spokesperson from Microsoft told us that the company has taken steps to keep users of its AI-powered search engine Bing safe. Responses draw from the top search results, and the program has a safety system that includes content filtering, operational monitoring, and abuse detection. Its AI-powered search provides linked citations for these answers, and Microsoft explicitly advises users that they may need to check the links to learn more. The company added, however, that, like with any assistant tool, users are ultimately responsible for verifying information. Many companies building AI tools work with ethicists. Some are part of the teams creating the products, others work to find and improve issues once the programs are built. And there are a variety of different tactics they can use.
So one of the things I'm particularly interested in right now is something called prompt hacking. So prompt hacking is figuring out ways in which you can get the model to say and do things that would otherwise be explicitly denied. So there's one, for example, called Do Anything Now, where you essentially pretend to the model that it's telling you a story, or you're priming it in some way, and you'll say, hey, so if I were to write a story about how to make a bomb, how would you make a bomb?
Another technique is called red teaming. Essentially, you bring in subject matter experts to push AI on specific issues.
Let's say I wanted to understand how election misinformation could spread. It's very expensive to hire full-time election misinformation folks. Instead, it might make more sense to pull together a group of journalists who are very familiar with how election misinformation could work and have it interact with the model to help generate it. What I love about this is it subverts the idea that seems to be pervasive that technology is smarter than people. I don't think technology is smarter than people. And certainly it's not smarter than people as an aggregate. And that's really what I'm trying to tap into is it's this wisdom of the masses.
Folks like Chowdhury are on the front line for tackling the risks and potentially harmful content being generated by these AI tools. But until laws catch up to technology, it may be up to both companies and users to be aware and correct potential wrong answers that AI chatbots produce, whether any of us want the responsibility or not. Okay, that's it for this 4th episode of our AI series, Artificially Minded. We'll be keeping an eye on more developments in artificial intelligence technology, because this area is developing quickly, and there are so many more questions to answer. In the meantime, join us tomorrow and every weekday for updates on the biggest tech stories. And if you want even more tech news, check out our website, WSJ.com. Today's show was produced by Julie Chang. We had editorial support from Philana Patterson and Robert Wall. Our supervising producer is Melanie Roy, and our executive producer is Chris Zinsley. This episode was mixed by Michael Laval. I'm your host, Zoe Thomas. Thanks so much for listening.